assuming. Hey, Mark, are we on? We're on? I mean, this is working. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to Covenant Sunday School, which once upon a time we had all the time, and then once upon a time we didn't have it. Actually, we didn't have it for years in the school and the hotel, but you don't remember. Most of you don't remember the school and then the hotel, and then the school. But we're glad to have you. We're going to have regular classes starting next week. Where did I put my book? So if you want to have the book, you don't have to. It's not necessary. I'm going to be doing classes, 6 or something classes. I think Bullett's going to spell me at one spot. It's a book by a man named Greg Beale, Redemptive Reversals. I'll explain it. This is a short layman's version of some work that he and some other theologians have been working on for years. It's just how God reverses all the fortunes of men in all sorts of ways, both in retribution and in redemption. So it goes two directions. Anyway, it's very fascinating. It'll all be text. It'll all be Bible passages, not just straight theology. Anyway, but this morning, Bill Anderson, Dr. Anderson, when he's speaking officially I notice he has his jacket on, so he is Dr. Anderson for us today. He will, of course, his doctorate's not in theology. His doctorate's not in theology or philosophy. Anyway, he was one of the delegates to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church General Assembly, which met at Dort College, a place, ordinarily when you say Dort College, the Dutch either bow their heads or rise. I don't know which one. It's a Dutch Reformed college in Dort, Iowa, named after Dordrecht, Holland, right? And the Synod of Dort, famous theological convocation of English, believe it or not, and Dutch theologians meeting in the second decade of the 17th century, 1617, 1619. Anyway, so Bill's going to give a report. Is that all you need to say?
Yeah.
Okay, he's got slides. I hate it when these people do all these high-level technology things because, you know me, I might have a handout now and again. Here we go. It's ready to roll.
Actually, this is a pretty low-level slide production. And actually, we can have a lot of interaction if you want to ask questions. And what I can't answer, probably many of them, Bill is going to fill in. See if I can get that thing on there. Okay, y'all can hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, so we're starting off our Sunday school series with this, which is, of course, an unusual way to start the Sunday school series. But as Bill has told you, we met at Dort University. It was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, Carol and Tony can certainly tell you that. The interesting little place, it was all contained. I imagine it would make for a good college experience because all of the students, I guess, would be captivated on cancer. But it was a really nice place for the, in many respects, for the General Assembly because we were all there, stayed in the dormitory, and the dormitory was just a couple of steps away from the convention hall. So we would go back and forth pretty freely. Although it was a pretty long, drag-out thing, this was the 87th General Assembly. The 86th was skipped because of COVID, so there was 2 years of work to do. Because of that, they actually added a day to the convention. And typically they would start at about 8 o'clock, 8:30, go to 9 o'clock at night with lunch break and dinner break, and you have time for breakfast and all of that. So it was a pretty full schedule. Intermixed, interestingly enough, with a lot of devotionals. A lot of that was very good. Sunday was a day that was devoted just to worship and had 2 services and a Sunday school. And of course, they were excellent. And that was sort of our schedule for about 7 days. We went out on a Wednesday and left on a Wednesday. Actually, I got home Thursday because I got stuck in Charlotte in one of these nightmares on the airline where I had to stay in the airport for close to 24 hours. But that was really a mess. It was a combination of weather and mechanical problems on the plane. But anyway, the GA is the highest court of appeal in governmental matters for the OPC. as everyone probably realizes, the OPC is, if nothing else, very ordered. And to flick the slide here. And of course, the OPC is governed by three primary documents. We have the Bible, of course, which was, we consider the infallible Word of God. We also have this confession of faith and catechisms. We're going through that in the evening now. These books are freely available. Sometimes they're on the back desk. And then you have the Book of Church Order. And the Book of Church Order contains the form of government. A lot of the General Assembly was about that, and the Book of Discipline. And the other component of this little book is a directory of public worship, which sort of guides ministers in, how to conduct an OPC ministry. But there was a lot of reference to this Book of Church Order during this meeting, particularly as it relates to appeals and complaints. Okay. So this year, this was the 87th. The 86th was in, 2019. This year, we had like it was close to 150 commissioners. That included the moderator. The moderator was, interestingly, a fellow that we had interviewed. Zach, what's his last name? Keel. Zach Keel. He's a minister in California, but he was elected to be moderator of this assembly. But he was actually one of the ones that we interviewed when we were searching for a new pastor. And very nice, very knowledgeable. You have a stated clerk, which is basically their secretary. You have ministers, and then you have ruling elders that are commissioned by their presbyteries. And I came to find out that we have like 16 presbyteries in the GA. I'm going to show you a map of that. It turns out that the representation, I guess, is based on congregant members. So some presbyteries actually have more commissioners than the others. I didn't really realize that. Our Presbytery of the South has had about, about 3 elders, and there were about 4 ministers. I think that's about right. So here is, I thought I would just show you this, just to kind of give you a sense of how the OPC fits within other Reformed churches. The OPC is actually an ecclesiastical fellowship with these 20 churches. And these churches, how often is it? Every several years meet with the International Conference of Reformed Churches. The Associated Reformed Presbyterian Church is about the size of the OPC in this country. They have about 30,000 members, which is what we have. Something a little bit more than 200 churches, 570, ministers. And some mission works going on. This is within the entire country. And we have this ecclesiastical fellowship. And interesting, all of these churches are joined together to promote the unity of the universal church. They all endorse the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, and the Westminster Confession of Faith. So you can look up and down the list. The PCA Church, they've been in the news a lot for Revoice. Do y'all know what that is? People know what that is? It's a movement within Reformed churches to ordain anyone, I guess, that they feel to be qualified. These can be homosexuals, transsexuals, women as well as men. And this was a big issue for the PCA this year at their GA. The PCA is about 10 times bigger than the OPC, so they are our larger sister, as they were referred to. Yes?
I don't think it's a movement to ordain those people. It's a movement to, Bullet probably would be much better at clarifying this. I think it's a movement to accept people who identify as homosexual, transgender, whatever.
There was actually a motion, I'll get to it later on. This gets to Stephen's question. This was the Reformed Church of the Netherlands. The OPC represents, or the representatives of the OPC are in this ecumenical ministry within the OPC. They're actually going to put a motion before the ICRC, this is this International Conference of Reformed Churches, to remove the Reformed Church of the Netherlands from the ICRC because they want to ordain women and other people. So anyway, so these are the churches, I guess in no, not North, anyway, these are 20 churches that are members of this ICRC. And we have ecclesiastical fellowship with them. I thought that was interesting. And then this last one, number 20, this United Reformed Church in North America, I didn't know much about them, but they actually created our Psalter hymnal in partnership with the OPC. So it just shows you how some of these relationships kind of extend. And an interesting part of the conference, I thought, was when various people in these other churches would come, they would generally send representatives to our GA, and they would give a report. The PCA gave a report, and I'll read this to you, because I thought it was very interesting, and it gets to this revoice issue. And this is a motion that their General Assembly came up with. It says, those who profess an identity, such as, but not limited to gay Christian, same-sex, attracted Christian, homosexual Christian, or like terms, that undermines or contradicts their identity as new creations in Christ, either by denying the sinfulness of fallen desires, or by denying the reality and hope of progressive sanctification. It's very legalistic. That's this whole conference. Some of these terms and everything were just really, it's kind of foreign to a physician. Or by falling to pursuit spirit-empowered victory over their sinful temptations, inclinations, and actions are not qualified for ordained office. So the PCA representative to the OPC, in his report, made this announcement. And this was apparently something that they are now submitting to their various churches for approval. I thought that was kind of interesting and some ways not really related to us, but at least this conference. But this revoice issue has become really a hot topic. And actually, one of the most interesting things, and you've heard Bill mention from the pulpit that there were several things that were going on at the GA that people were watching the OPC for. And it was kind of related, and we'll get that to the very end, somewhat related to this whole revoice issue. Okay. So the idea is, if you look at the polity of the OPC, or kind of the organizational structure, now many of y'all may know this, but our little church here has been described as an unusual OPC church. And people on the search committee kind of struggled with that. We didn't realize we were unusual. But when we sort of began to understand that, it was the idea that a lot of our church members come from maybe conservative and reform backgrounds, but don't have a lot of knowledge about the OPC. And so we were actually looking for a minister that came from sort of a similar church. That was actually one of Bullett's qualifications, because the church that he was from was, I think, somewhat similar to the demographics of our church. But anyway, to get back to the polity of the OPC, it's bottom up. It starts with the local church. Covenant, for example, has 6 elders, ruling elders, and 2 pastors. We are in the Presbytery of the South. There are 17 churches in the Presbytery of the South. There are 16 presbyteries in the OPC. And so the General Assembly is basically, I sort of think of it from a court perspective, the Supreme Court over all of that. All of the discipline and things like that goes kind of trickles up from the bottom. Okay, and that's what a lot of the appeals were in this meeting. It was people appealing decisions that had been made at a lower court level, you might say. So this is an example. It shows you how the 16 presbyteries are carved out. We're, of course, here at the bottom, the little blue dots are for our churches in the Presbytery of the South. And you can see how the various presbyteries are distributed. And at the GA, everybody had representatives based on the number of communicant members within their presbytery. Kind of reminds you sort of the House of Representatives in the U.S. government. Okay, all right. This is just sort of an expanded view of the Presbytery of the South and our 17 churches or so. So you see, we extend all the way up to the southwest corner of Tennessee and over to Louisiana and down to Key West. Any questions so far? Anybody? Yes.
Do you know how these boundaries were established historically?
It's a little bit like salamandering. I do think that there is some kind of negotiation, even politics, to sort of these boundaries. And I don't know the undercurrent of it, but there was some discussion at that over lunch. People were talking about, in fact, one of the presbyteries, one of the overtures for the church was to divide the Presbytery of the Northwest up into two, or maybe the Presbytery of the Midwest into two. And so figuring out the boundaries became, I guess, in some sense, a little political, So it is interesting, and I don't know how these boundaries got established. Bill, do you have any insight?
It's the number of churches, travel distances for a meet. We meet twice, maybe 3 times a year as a presbytery. So we used to be with the group that's in the darker green. That used to be one presbytery, but it got to be too many churches. Travel was too far, so we cut it in half. A lot of it's just history. Once you get a certain number of churches, I mean, some of the presbyteries were gigantic originally, and then you get more churches, you start cutting them into pieces.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Marie. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, do you offhand know those that are tagged with the letters N and Q or O in the panhandle?
I think when I pulled this map off of the OPC website,
Oh,
and,
okay, so-
and I think they just used the letters to identify the name of the church.
Okay.
On the website itself, for example, P, I guess, looks like it's Covenant. So it was just, I don't think they mean anything special. Okay. Did we skip one? Let's see.
From here to there.
Okay. All right. So, the GA was kind of divided up, at least it seemed to me, into committee reports, appeals, and complaints. And they kind of jumped around a little bit, but a lot of the committee reports, most of them came first. There's I guess it's this month's New Horizon, has an article on this. And matter of fact, I think I've got a copy here. Yeah, here it is. And if you want to, you can kind of open this up and get a little bit more extensive view of some of these various reports. I'm just sort of highlighting some of the things that stuck out to me. So Christian Education has co-sponsored since the last GA 31 ministerial internships, and have provided, over $300,000 for those internships. We have foreign missions in a lot of countries, and the GA was kind of spiced throughout with reports from some of the pastors in these various areas. It was really very interesting. Home missions and church extension, sometimes you hear the term CHMKE. It stands for the Committee on Home Missions and Church Extension. There are 5 new missions work began receiving aid, and there was an emphasis on the GA establishing what they call these RHMs. These are regional home missionaries. I sort of think of them as roving pastors who kind of help churches within the presbytery and also help establish new mission work. Y'all may remember David Chilton came, and I think he preached twice here during the interim before we had Bullitt. And he is now the RHM for the Presbytery of the South. I really enjoyed this Ecumenicy and Interchurch Relationships Committee. And this is what I mentioned earlier. This was one of the things that they're going to do. They're going to, this committee will represent the OPC at the ICRC, the International Conference for Reformed Churches. And they're going to make a proposal, this was discussed at the GA, to suspend this Reformed church in the Netherlands because of their desire to ordain homosexuals and things like that. Okay? There's a chaplain report. There are 7 OPC chaplains serving in active duty and others that are serving kind of like in reserve units. John Meether, I guess is in Oviedo. He's been the historian. They've written this really very fascinating report, and you can see this in the New Horizons. But he's, pardon me, written a large number of historical books in the OPC, if y'all are interested in that at all. But he resigned after 22 years, and they had to elect a new committee chairman. There was a lot of interest in the diaconal committee, and they highlighted some of the help that they've given to various sessions during the COVID pandemic. They have raised about $75,000 for COVID relief fund. The Ministerial Care Committee was really interesting. I didn't realize this, but they have retirement plans, financial counseling, and so forth for any active minister or active employee for the OPC. There was a lot of talk about burnout for ministers, and I guess this is something that it would be good for all churches to sort of be aware of. I think when you think of the burden that, say, a minister like Bullitt and, of course, Eric and Bill, it's a lot to do. I mean, they make the joke, they only work one day a week, so how could they be tired? But, of course, as we all know, there's a lot that goes on during the week and a lot of preparation for Sunday. Eric was telling us that in seminary, they're taught that you should take about 20 hours to prepare one sermon. And of course, all of that requires time in the midst of all of their other duties. So I thought that was interesting. And they actually have financial support for a minister who needs a sabbatical. They were even recommending sabbaticals after about 5 years or so for a minister, just to let them get away and kind of rethink things. And there was a special committee for linguistic changes. They're trying to sort of update the confessions only with things like what they call morphologic changes, executeth to execute, and archaic, words they're going to replace, these and thous and that sort of stuff. Okay? So the other half, it wasn't divided that way, but basically seemed like about the other half of the GA were overtures, appeals, and complaints. And this was really very interesting, I thought. Strict following of the Robert's Rules of Order. An overture was anything that sought a change in the form of government in our Book of Church Order. There were 4 judicial appeals from 3 presbyteries. So these appeals that came from within the presbytery, appealing to the GA, or the Supreme Court of the OPC. And there were 9 complaints from 4 presbyteries. One thing that I felt really good about in listening to a lot of these complaints and appeals, I think the Presbytery of the South is in pretty good shape, because a lot of what you see, some of the problems that have arisen because of these complaints, I don't think the Presbytery of the South, fortunately, and God bless, doesn't have. And also the Presbytery of the South is pretty well represented at the GA level. A lot of our ministers were serving on various committees and things like that. So I came away, at least from, some of this, thinking that we were in a very strong presbytery. Okay? So just a very brief kind of review. I guess we're going to end at 10:30. We're sort of running out of time because I do want to get to the most interesting appeals. This first overture was really interesting and created a lot of discussion, and it was COVID related. I think a lot of churches felt a lot more pressure than we did here in Florida to suspend worship. And I think that there was an appeal from the people that presented this overture for the OPC to make a statement as a denomination about how much control a church should allow the government to have. And this was a very interesting, I thought, parliamentary procedure. Alan Strange, who many of y'all seen here, he preached here, he very wise. He postponed this indefinitely. Now, what that means is that you never have to make a decision. And I think the reason it was good, because there was some division in the GA. Some people wanted this, and others thought it was kind of not needed and maybe too much confrontation with the government. And I think no one really wanted to be on record one way or the other. It would have been bad for those to vote not to do this. And so I thought this was a pretty wise move. A second overture was to divide the presbytery of the Midwest up, and then you get into this dividing presbyteries and all that you were referring to. Okay. This complaint 1 and 2, this was interesting. It was just kind of, again, it was a narrow interpretation of something in the book of church order. In our presbytery, there was a church that brought a complaint to a presbytery, to a church in another presbytery. And there was an argument. You can imagine how long something like this might take, but I guess the Supreme Court has to do these sorts of things. The argument was the other church in a different presbytery said that a church in another presbytery couldn't bring a complaint against it. But the book of church order is pretty clear about it, that a session can complain against a session regardless of which presbytery you're in. And anyway, that was sustained. But, these things take a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth. This was another one, complaint 3 and 4. This was a complaint that came out of the Presbytery of the Dakotas, POD. And this was a struggling presbytery, in my opinion. They had a lot of problems, it seemed like. And in the 85th GA, the GA had reprimanded or remanded a complaint to go back to the presbytery, but it sounds like the presbytery didn't respond to it correctly, so it came back to the GA, and the GA sent it back. All right, this one was one of ones I think that Bill might have been referring to, this complaint 5. This was a minister that was charged with spousal abuse, and some of it was really pretty graphic and pretty bad. But he was appealing the decision anyway. The appeal was denied. But that was, I think, probably one of the most uncomfortable kind of appeals that came out. This next one, complaint 6, this was a strange one. I guess I'm going through these things just so you see how these things come up. There was a church member who was visiting a mission work in this presbytery of the Southwest. And he created some kind of ruckus. Apparently, he got loud and even insulting. And the ministers who were helping form the mission barred him from coming back to the church. And he was a member of another church, but he wanted to go to this new church because it was closer to his home. Anyway, that ended up being denied, meaning that he was appealing the barring, but the appeal was denied. And there was a lot of sort of second guessing about that. Maybe that really wasn't the right thing to do because the member had apologized, but the session still did not want him to attend that church. One of the reasons was because it was just a new mission, and it was a church that was developing, and I think they felt they didn't need the confrontation. Okay. This was really, I never quite understood this appeal. I'm going to more or less skip over it. But there were two people charged with the same thing. for violating the third commandment and the ninth commandment. And of course, these are the third and ninth commandments, but I never quite understood personally. And that was the problem with a lot of these appeals. A lot of these appeals and complaints are not really, you don't get much context about whatever brought the appeal up in the first place. That's not the issue. Like the issue about whether a session can charge another session. I never understood what the complaint was that the session was complaining about, but that was not the issue. The issue was, could the session charge the session? And that's what the GA discussed. Yes?
Who then votes on whether it's denied or?
The General Assembly. That's what the commissioner
So
did.
you
Yeah,
voted.
yeah. And I did learn this. I think understanding the sort of the way it works, it would make you a better commissioner. Because I think when I was there this year, I was just kind of a participant. But I think once you begin to understand, you know, how things are organized and all of that, and I would invite everybody to come to the presbytery meetings, particularly when they're here in Covenant. You learn a lot about the church. And I think in some ways it makes you feel good about the church, because all of these things are really done, really ultimately to preserve the church and to preserve the unity of the church. And even the appeals that were denied, I can honestly say that they were taken well. You know, people accepted the reprimand and they moved on. So I thought, and that was the good thing about the GA. It was kind of like the discussion in it. You couldn't go anywhere else. You know, once the Supreme Court had, so to speak, had finished the appeal, then it was done. Okay? And this was interesting, this appeal 4. This was an example where the father of the person that made the complaint apparently created a ruckus in the church. But he was old, and I gather, you know, perhaps maybe a little senile. And anyway, the son took offense at the church's response. And it wasn't clear to me what the church's response was. But anyway, the old man died, and the ministers wanted to attend the funeral, but the son didn't want them to attend the funeral, and they attended anyway. And that's what the complaint was about. And he ended up being excommunicated because of this unwillingness to forgive. He held this grudge against these ministers. And when, in good faith, they were trying to do, I think, what they thought was right. Okay, and I think the last one. Now, this is the one that was really interesting, I think, the most interesting. It took a lot of time up. Are y'all familiar with Amy Bird? Again, this gets to this revoice issue in some respects. Y'all ever heard of Amy Bird? She is actually an OPC member in good standing in a church in Greensboro, I think. And she wrote a book. One of her early books was her Housewife Theologian. You can Google her if you're. I got really interested in this, and so I learned a lot more about her than, I didn't know much about her at all. But in order to understand the appeal, I was kind of interested to try to figure out, what all of this was about. And she wrote a book called Recovering from Biblical Manhood. And she wrote Manhood and Womanhood. And she wrote that book in May 2020. Now, that book was in direct response, I believe, to this council on biblical manhood and womanhood. Now, this was this Evangelical Theological Society in 1987 put out this statement. And their statement was they wanted to set forth the teachings of the Bible about the complementary differences between men and women created equally in the image of God, because these teachings are essential for obedience to Scripture and for health of the family and church. And I think a lot of women, particularly women might be classified as feminists, take offense to this. And they see this as sort of an equality issue, that a statement like this in some way implies that men and women are not equal. And I think that's what Amy Bird was trying to write a book about. Anyway, two ministers in particular took real offense to Amy Bird's book and other things that she had written. And I think, go to the next one. And that's what these complaints were about. So these, one minister in particular, on sort of an anonymous website, was very critical of her, and even used the term ravenous wolf, which was a direct reference to Matthew 7:15, which is a reference to false prophets. And so in a sense, by the minister calling Amy Byrd a ravenous wolf, he was accusing her of being a false prophet and a devil advocate. And this is something that a minister, and Bill I know should say something about. This is something that a minister should never say, particularly for someone that's not under their jurisdiction. This woman was actually a church member in a church in the Presbytery of the Southeast. So technically, if any discipline was to occur, it should have come for anything she did, although no one is actually saying that she did anything in her book. In fact, there's an interesting article in Ordained Servant written by an OPC minister in response to this. I'll read you the first paragraph. He says, Amy Byrd, an OPC member who supports the headship of husbands and ordination for males only to a gospel ministry, writes this work in critique of biblical manhood and womanhood. So the OPC minister is explaining in this article that what she was really doing was sort of, writing a critique of this statement here on the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And according to everyone else, she has not done anything out of lines and has no reason to be reprimanded. And in this book, this article here, it's actually very complimentary of a lot of things that Amy is saying. But anyway, these ministers went out and they accused her of being a ravenous wolf, one in particular. The other member just simply condoned what the first person had said. And that was complaints 7 and 8. The person that basically condoned what Minister 1 said, basically his appeal was upheld, really. But the other person was not, because of his language that he used. He has actually been suspended from the ministry. And then the 9th complaint was that the Presbytery of the Southwest, in his trial, they actually tried this minister for what he said about Amy Byrd. And in the trial, the Presbytery allowed him to use the word ravenous wolf, which should not have been allowed, even in the context of a trial. And so the GA felt that the minister that had written this piece, complaint 8, should be sustained, but they also felt that the Presbytery, which was the non-appeal, had been wrong in allowing him to use the word in the trial and also had not disciplined him enough. And that's what the appeal was about. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion. And at the very end, and this was kind of at the end, and at the very end of the meeting, it was somewhat, and this was the other thing, the GA basically recommended that the Presbytery of the South go back to Amy Byrd and apologize to her in writing and actually try to contact her personally for allowing what happened to go on. And then I got one more slide. But then at the end, I think maybe because of this and other things, and Bullitt mentioned this last week, this is how the GA ended, that the Assembly is calling for a day of prayer and fasting on the 21st of August, and this was printed in our bulletin last week. And that's actually about all I had, Bill. Right now, you have anything to add about the complaints or anything? Can I ask you a question? No, I was teasing. No, we're done, right? Okay. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Thank you. Set us up here.
For those of you who've wondered why we have coffee, we originally started the coffee thing for the period between Sunday school and church. And then when we dropped Sunday school, we dropped coffee. And then we started coffee before we started Sunday school. And I think some of us, like me, sort of forgot the point. So the coffee was for the Sunday school hour when you don't need to hold a hymn book or do anything else with your hands. So anyway, there is coffee in the foyer, and you're welcome to that. It's the children's class. Technically, Sunday school is 10:45 to 10:30. And then we have this time in between to talk to each other, and worship begins at 11. So thank you for coming. As I said before, next week I'll start a little series of biblical studies on what the man who wrote the book I studied under, he called them ironic reversals. And we'll have some definitions and things at the beginning. But, some of them are obvious. God chose the nothing things of the world to shame the wise, right? 1 Corinthians on the cross, foolishness of the cross. That's one of that. That's a redemptive reversal, but there are also other reversals. You'll know them from the Psalms, right? Psalm 5, Psalm 15, I know Psalm 5. The wicked man builds a pit for his neighbor, and then in admiring it stumbles back into it. So that's in Latin it's called lex talionis. You get what you tried to deliver. That's the note. Well, see, so that's the one kind of reversal is redemptive, and one kind of reversal is retributive. It's retribution. So the famous quote is, I think on that line, the famous quote I know anyway is Thomas Watson, the Puritan: "Sin is its own reward." Okay? All right. No, sorry.
Just before we depart this, what we've been talking about and the importance of church government and the General Assembly, I just want to say, it's interesting that you point out that our congregation is a little different and that we come from so many different backgrounds, but I will tell you that that's part of why years ago, I would say Brett and I kind of discovered that we were Reformed as we began to home educate and really look at the foundations of our country and where those ideas came from. And I want to just express my appreciation and how important it is that churches do hold to biblical government. We came out of a church that really didn't, and it was tremendously damaging to the church body.
Right. Yeah, so we say about OP churches, we are Presbyterian and Reformed. That is, we're Reformed in our theology, soteriology, worship. But Presbyterian means we're ruled by elders in a succession of courts, right? Session, presbytery, General Assembly. That's not uncommon, but it's not, obviously there's several forms of church government, right? You have the top-down form of government, bishop, down would be Methodist churches, Episcopal churches, Anglican churches. Then you have ones like us, who are usually connected to Reformed things. A lot of Reformed Baptists have similar kinds of government that we do. And then you have a congregational form of government where every matter is brought to the whole congregation. If you've ever seen one, it's like a New England town hall meeting, where the budget in the town hall is approved in one terrifying meeting of the entire community at once. If you've ever seen one, it's pretty exciting. Anyway, and so some churches organize themselves on a congregational form. And those are the three you'd read about in a textbook. But there is now, if you look around, you'll have seen this here in a big church, the modern way to do polity, right, politics, the way to do it, is the corporate model. So you have paid officers who do everything. So, for example, I've seen a Presbyterian bulletin, and on the back it has a list of all the paid staff, 20, 30 people, and at the bottom it says, for a list, in very small print, for a list of our elders and deacons, please call the church office. So you see, that's not one of the classic ways of doing church government. That's having, Christian education has that person's paid, and then the youth, all the various levels at every sort of thing. That's a newer kind of church government. But remember, the New Testament, they didn't have mega churches and mega facilities and mega this and mega that. And That's the American fascination with the word large. Large better, small, no, okay, anyway. Okay. Good, have a cup of coffee, talk to a friend. Talk to someone you don't know, that's good. Let's put this on.